At IIED, we work for the Least Developed Countries group since they formed as a negotiating group at the UNFCCC. And over the last couple of years, we've been working with them to try and get a shared understanding of what isn't working around the role of support that the rich countries have promised the poorer countries and what it is that they actually need. There is a massive challenge for the poorest countries to develop in the context of climate change. The pathways for development are not going to be the same as they were for the richer countries. And so how the Paris Agreement gets delivered is particularly critical for the very poorest countries. So just to start with the politics, the African countries fall into 4 different groups within the negotiating process between the Arab group in the north, the African group of nations, which is all the countries, the least developed countries, and OASIS. They have some countries in the OASIS bloc. So for the least developed countries, there are 47 countries, 33 are in Africa, and so they're very dominant in the least developed countries in terms of setting the agenda. But the advantage to the least developed countries group as a bloc is that there are no oil-rich countries, no middle-income countries, or very few oil-rich countries. We've just got Angola and Tanzania, really. And they work together as a progressive voice, more so than perhaps the Africa group. But as I go through, I'm going to try and distinguish between what is very much a consensus position across the LDCs and the AGN and what is less consensus. At this very moment, there's a strong feeling that the Paris Agreement is hanging in the balance. That's about countries being prepared to step up their ambitions, use the ratchet mechanism to increase the amount of ambition they're asking for in the NDCs, at the same time actually providing the means of support. Now, there were 3 areas under this package, this means of support, which is the offer by the rich countries to the poorer countries, and that's climate finance, technology and capacity. But in many ways, it's all fits within climate finance is the critical piece of this because technology transfer and capacity both come on the back of climate finance. But there's very low trust as little finance has been reaching the poorest countries. And this is in part because whilst a commitment might be made, actually getting that transfer to the partner takes time, and then disbursement takes even longer. And when we looked at this a couple of years ago, we found that actually out of all the commitments, only 8% had actually been dispersed. But there's a bigger problem as well, that business as usual projects, the way that development has operated for decades, within the climate change sphere has even more challenges. And what we're seeing is that the national architecture is not being built, and institutional capacity, domestic institutional capabilities are not being created. The delivery challenges that are being faced, what this business as usual feels like for the least developed countries group, they set out their unique challenges to deliver the SDGs in light of climate change and highlighted that they were receiving just 18% of climate finance, and they represent 1 billion people and they represent the very poorest people on the planet. They are also prioritizing adaptation very heavily. They don't have very much mitigation to do. Note that only 20% of global climate finance is for adaptation, with just 10%. So $1 in 10 is being committed with the purpose of reaching the local level. But the other thing that they're highlighting is that only 7% of the finance is actually coming through their own domestic systems. So the NDCs are based on what they have at the moment in terms of their national climate plans, their NDCs. They were developed in a great rush and based on whatever sectoral strategies they had on the books at the time. They were largely developed through short-term external fly-in, fly-out missions over a 2-week period, and they don't actually represent their priorities. There is an opportunity in the short term to update these, and many have started to do so, but with the intention of making the NDCs more representative of what they really want, as well as making sure that the adaptation priorities are set out either within their NAPs or their NDCs. We're not really expecting many of them to actually present these in this next year because they're trying to do it in a much more whole of government approach, which obviously takes longer and requires workshops. So what they identified as their biggest challenge is that most of the business as usual climate finance that they're receiving are one-size-fits-all solutions being offered by multilaterals and then delivered by them. So it might be the FAO saying, look, we've got this idea, we want 6 countries to be included, and then we'll apply to the GCF, do you want it? And there's a sense that if you don't say yes to these, you won't get any climate finance at all. So the bar is very low in terms of saying, no, that's not fitting with our national objectives. There's also a sense that the type of projects that are coming are inadequate. They're not sufficiently broad, they're not sufficiently coherent to really help the governments change their approaches and start to deliver climate resilience across all their development activities, and are very expensive. So there's a lot of international expertise. It's a highly intermediated process. So for example, DFID might give money to the GCF might give money to a UN body, the UN body might then pass it on to a delivery partner, and then it arrives in country, and then there are a whole lot of actors that also get involved. If you add up all the administrative cuts that are taken on that, that can come to more than 50% of the finances lost before it even reaches the country and starts doing activities in country. And then finally, it's very ineffective in building their domestic capabilities because it's being run through project units that are not through the core civil service. So what they're asking for, and this is common across the LDCs and Africa, that story resonates with everyone. You don't find any of the poorer countries with whom this doesn't make sense. What we're hearing is that what they really want, and we hear this at a ministerial level, is they want a coherent response to what they see as 3 interlinked crises around climate, around poverty, as well as around the integrity of their ecosystems. The ministerial ambition is around achieving Sendai as well. So basically achieving all of their international commitments in one go. They recognise they've got very limited capacity and they don't want lots and lots of small projects trying to do different things. They want to really develop a coherent response across government. And this has got a very strong focus on local. Now, this is in part perhaps why they were so interested in working with IIED. We did the piece of analysis that said only $1.10 reaches the local level, and have been looking for ways where that could be improved without increasing transaction costs. How is it that a donor sitting in headquarters can actually ensure that climate finance is arriving in the most transformational way into communities across the globe? This is not to say that action is not needed at the international, national or regional levels. This is just to say that the local level is incredibly important, particularly for adaptation, but also for nature and the reduction of poverty, because that is where you can really begin to understand what the underlying drivers of vulnerability are, how to combine generational knowledge with science and technical solutions to create ways of resolving trade-offs and identifying synergies. We've developed this sort of analogy around business as usual, which is highly intermediated. Projects come and go. So that's the pipe, is just on the left. And the idea is that, what we kept hearing from governments and from communities on the ground and local governments is that one day they've got a project, the next day it's gone. And once it's gone, it doesn't take very long till the only thing that's left is maybe a broken down Land Rover in someone's car park. Most of the TA, the thinking, the systems, because they weren't being delivered through government's core systems, they don't persist. What they're asking for is a change in approach. And the diagram on the right was developed with the Least Developed Countries group and represents 3 types of mechanisms that they're considering. One is state delivery, one is society delivery, and one is private sector delivery. And the idea is to find processes that actually aggregate local action in ways that you can get finance through a mechanism. So within the state delivery mechanisms, for example, there's decentralization or social protection or a landscape-based intervention around watersheds. These are the types of things they've been looking at. And what it is that donor needs to do, the type of finance a donor needs to provide to deliver this, is partly what we'll be looking at. There are a set of things that they're really almost the principles behind this. They want reduced intermediation. They want to, at the end of a program, be able to access the GCF directly through enhanced direct access. They want to build on what is already there. They don't want new systems. They don't want something that is, a climate only approach. They want to use climate finance to strengthen the development architecture and get the development architecture delivering climate resilience and low emission development pathways. So they want to strengthen their own delivery mechanisms, and they want to strengthen the agility of their institutions to be able to cope with unexpected futures. So They recognise that there's a lot of uncertainty in the climate futures in most of the countries, and they recognise that they now need to build flexible responses that can be changed as more information arrives, try and be robust to that range of climate futures as much as possible. The part of what they've identified is that you need appropriate subsidiarity. Now, this is about getting decision-making to the right level, but as close to citizens as possible, giving authority and resources to local governments to work with communities or to households or to enterprises to take the right action, but also to have the right information to be able to take action. This work sort of built on some of our earlier research, which was looking at what are the delivery mechanisms where you begin to see really transformational outcomes that act as an aggregating platform of local action and therefore create an investment pot that bigger investors like the larger donors or the GCF can put finance into. And there were 4 broad areas around this. Obviously, the aggregating local action is the critical first step, but by bringing community together and bringing a lot of different actors together, they then begin to influence policy and influence the incentive system much more effectively. You need to invest early in long-term capabilities rather than trying to bypass that. There is no shortcut to an effective, more transformational system. And it's all about building trust, which requires a huge amount of increase in transparency in dialogue. And also in setting standards that are understandable by a donor, for example, but also understandable by a community. That you're beginning to develop a system where everybody's voices count, not just the donors. So the sort of main thing to say is that good practices evolve over time. You can't just design this and it's delivering immediately. You need to start on a journey and keep trying to learn quickly and improve over time. Politically astute approaches are critical to this because that's what it takes to grow institutions. And this is not rocket science. This we've seen again and again in many different localities, but it's really not what most projects are currently delivering. And what we found is that there's a lot of small grant finance out there which has a role to support transformation. But in climate finance, most of it is late stage finance. It's the scaling up finance that the GCF and the MDBs and the larger donors are generally offering. So what we're missing is, like in the innovation space, like in the technology space, we're missing the middle finance, the incubation finance that is prepared to take some risks, take some of the ideas that's developed through the small grants and begin to grow it into a mechanism that can deliver at real scale. The least developed countries worked on these ideas. We ran a series of deliberative workshops and evidence reviews. So we brought people together, said, what's the best you've seen? They came up with different things. We went out and gathered information on that, synthesized that, came back to another workshop. So it was a process over a year and a half. It started as a focus just on climate resilience, but the ministers basically said, it's got to be much more strategic, it's got to be much more coherent. So they've ended up with this 2050 vision, which covers emissions, poverty, and nature. And this just gives you a sense of what they've come up with. UNCAS at the Climate Summit in September last year, they set out their offer of what they will do to deliver a really different way of acting on climate. And their ask of the international community was around stepping up and providing the right type of finance and committing to actually deliver through the LDC's own institutional capabilities. Now, this had huge support from AOSIS and from the African Group of Nations. So we can say that this is pretty much a consensus. There was really strong support. But what the LDC group then did was go to the COP last year. They set out a partnership compact and asked the donors that had said that they're behind this ask to actually sign up. And now we're in the stage of beginning to work through how this could be delivered. And that is around providing risk-tolerant finance through a mechanism that can come into countries behind their own priorities and a really strong focus on the institutional capabilities. And this has got the Africa Adaptation Initiative is very interested in the ideas within the LDC group and have said that they would also like to support its delivery. This is kind of where they are now. They've set out what types of mechanisms they'll be most interested in. It's basically they're going to start with these 3, but there would be other systems like health systems and so on that would also need support. They are asking for support with a very pragmatic focus. So it's about how do you create incentives across the whole of society, across the whole of government to change how development and economic activities are done. They're seeking to ensure it's collaborative. It's not just about state delivery. It's about private investors. It's about private enterprise. It's about communities and it's about households. And what we're currently working on with DFID and the Irish, who are going to be the first donors for this process, is how to set up a system where there are basically simple procedures, very high transparency, and very clear budgets and decision rules that will allow all of the actors through the system from the beginning to the end to develop something and make sure that 70% of the finance is invested behind local communities. We've just done a 10-year budget, and we reckon by the last year it would be 90% would actually be delivered behind local community priorities. But critical to this is also ensuring this is a robust strategy. So it's robust to the range of different climate futures and the range of extreme events, and not just a single set, which is one of, in some ways, the biggest challenges these countries are facing right now, because everyone is still using averages, either current climate averages or future climates.